Victor Hale did not knock. He walked through the front door of Rafter K Ranch like a man who had already decided he owned it. His coat dusted from the ride, but his expression clean and deliberate. The kind of deliberate that comes not from confidence, but from years of practicing contempt. He stopped in the middle of the front room, looked at the woman standing near the kitchen doorway, and let his gaze travel over her the way a man appraises livestock he has already decided to pass on. "So this is what you've come to, Caleb," he said, loud enough that two ranch hands near the door could hear. "Hiring charity cases." Maggie Holloway did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only gave men like Victor Hale what they came for. But her hands, hidden in the folds of her apron, pressed together until the knuckles whitened. If you have ever been judged before you opened your mouth, if you have ever watched someone decide your worth before learning your name, then you already know exactly what Maggie felt standing in that doorway. And if you have ever had to decide in that precise moment whether to shrink or to hold your ground, then this story belongs to you. Before we go further, if you're watching this for the first time, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you are watching from. These stories travel farther than we expect, and we love knowing how far they go. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because Victor Hale was not the first obstacle Margaret Holloway had faced. He was just the one wearing the finest coat. The town of Granger, Montana had a particular way of measuring a person, and it did not use kindness as its scale. It used the width of your shoulders, the cut of your clothes, the number of acres attached to your name. And for a woman, especially a woman who had outlived her husband, spent 2 winters alone, and walked into every shop in town asking for work only to be turned away with excuses thin as paper, the measurement was crueler still. It was applied before you finished your sentence, sometimes before you finished your first step through the door. Maggie had stopped being surprised by it. That was the part she never told anyone, that the surprise had worn off, which was almost worse than the sting itself. When you stop being surprised, it means you have accepted something you should never have had to accept. She was 34 years old. She was broad-shouldered, heavy-set, and had the kind of hands that told the truth about a person. Rough at the knuckles, scarred along the right palm from a kitchen fire she had put out herself at age 19, strong in the grip. She had dark hair she kept pinned back because loose hair was impractical, and eyes that were brown and steady and saw more than people expected. Her husband Roy had been dead for 14 months. He had not been a bad man. He had not been a particularly good one either. He had been a man who meant well in warm weather and struggled in the cold. And the winter that took him had been the longest Granger had seen in a decade. A chest sickness. 3 weeks of watching him fight it, then one morning when he simply didn't. Maggie had buried him with the minister's help and the neighbor woman's casserole and nothing else. The property they had rented, a small house on the edge of town that Roy paid for with his work at the sawmill, reverted to the owner within 60 days of Roy's death. The owner was polite about it, which almost made it worse. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped she would land on her feet. He said these things while handing her a written notice with a date circled in ink. She had 60 days. In those 60 days, Maggie had tried everything a woman in her position could try. She went to the boarding house on Clement Street and asked if they needed a cook. The woman at the desk looked at her, looked at the space she occupied in the doorway, and said they had just filled the position. The position had not been filled. Maggie knew because she had seen the notice still posted in the window when she walked away. She tried the laundry service on Halbrook. The man there said he needed someone who could work fast on her feet all day. He said this while not quite meeting her eyes. She tried the schoolteacher's house, where a widow had posted a notice for a household helper. The widow opened the door, looked at Maggie, said she needed to think about it, and closed the door. She did not answer when Maggie returned the following morning. Each refusal had its own particular texture. Some were blunt, some were slippery. Some were wrapped in politeness that made them harder to push back against because there was nothing solid to grip. But they all came from the same place. They all began with the same look, that half-second assessment, eyes traveling the length of her, the slight shift in expression that meant the decision was already made. Maggie was not a woman who cried easily. Crying required a kind of luxury she had never been able to afford, the luxury of believing someone might hear it and do something useful. So she did not cry. She kept a list in her head of what she could do, what she had tried, and what remained. By the time 53 days had passed, the list of what remained was nearly empty. It was Mrs. Eakins at the dry goods store who mentioned Rafter K, and she mentioned it the way people mention things they expect won't work out, half helpful, half bracing. She said the Whitmore Ranch up on the North Ridge was looking for somebody to manage the household. Cook, clean, keep things in order. Cabin provided. Caleb Whitmore had been running the place alone since his wife passed, and the children were suffering for the lack of a steady hand in the house. "It's a hard post," Mrs. Eakins said, rolling brown paper around a block of salt. "Remote, rough winters. He's not an easy man from what people say. Not mean, just closed up. And the boy Thomas, he's had a hard time of it." She slid the package across the counter and added, almost as an afterthought, "He posted the notice 3 weeks ago, and nobody's taken it." Maggie asked if there was a reason for that. Mrs. Eakins looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been honesty. "The usual reasons women don't take remote postings. It's a long way out. It's just him and the children. People talk." "People talk about everything," Maggie said. "They do," Mrs. Eakins agreed. "Doesn't stop the talking." Maggie picked up the package, thanked her, and walked out into the cold. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment. The wind off the mountains cut through her coat at the collar. Down the street, a man was loading supplies into a wagon, and a pair of women she recognized from the church auxiliary walked past without looking at her. Not deliberately. She was simply not someone they thought to look at. She thought about what she had left. 7 days on the rental, $11.40 wrapped in a cloth inside her boot, a suitcase, and a trunk. Skills that nobody in this town had bothered to actually consider. She thought about Rafter K Ranch. Then she stopped thinking and started walking north. The road to Rafter K was not a road in any generous sense of the word. It was a track worn into the ground by wagon wheels and horse hooves, climbing through stands of pine and along a ridge that looked out over a valley so wide and cold and indifferent it made a person feel very small and also, strangely, very honest. Maggie had no horse. She walked. It took the better part of a day. Her boots were not built for that kind of distance, and by the time she crested the last rise and saw the ranch buildings laid out below her, main house, barn, 2 smaller structures, a fence line running east in a long straight thread, her feet had told her several things she did not want to hear. She stopped at the top of the rise and looked down. It was not what she expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. The buildings were solid, well made, the kind of construction that spoke of someone who had built to last, not to impress. The house had a wide porch, a stone chimney with smoke threading up from it, and windows that needed washing. The yard between the house and the barn had the particular disorder of a place where someone was working hard enough that appearances had been deprioritized, not abandoned, just moved down the list. She could see a light in the main house window. She walked down. She knocked at the front door and waited. The man who opened it was not what she had expected either. Caleb Whitmore was somewhere in his early 40s, though he looked like a man who had done more living than his years entirely accounted for. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked physically and forgot to eat when things were hard, with the jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were gray-green and direct in a way that was not unkind, but was not warm either. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled and the kind of expression that belonged to someone who had been interrupted in the middle of something and was trying to decide if the interruption was worth the pause. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm here about the posting," Maggie said. "Cook and housekeeper." Something moved through his expression. Not the look she was used to, not the traveling assessment with the conclusion already written at the end of it. It was something more like surprise, and not the unkind kind. "You walked out here?" he said. "I did." He looked past her, at the track she had come down. "From Granger?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." That was the beginning. The inside of the main house was exactly what the outside had promised. Built by someone who knew what they were doing, maintained by someone who was too busy to stay ahead of everything. The front room was large, with a stone fireplace on the far wall and a table that could seat 8 and a set of shelves that held more practical items than decorative ones. It smelled of wood smoke and something beneath that, not quite neglect, but the specific absence of certain kinds of attention. 2 children stood near the fireplace watching her. The girl was perhaps 8, with her father's dark coloring and a cautiousness in her posture that was the particular cautiousness of a child who has learned that new things in the house don't always stay. She had one hand on the mantel and was watching Maggie with enormous brown eyes that gave away more than she probably intended. The boy was older, 12 or 13, with his arms crossed and his weight back on his heels, and the kind of expression that said he had already decided something and was waiting for the world to confirm it. He did not look hostile exactly. He looked defended. "This is Lily," Caleb said, nodding toward the girl. "And Thomas." Maggie looked at both of them. She did not perform warmth. She had always found performed warmth unconvincing, and children especially could detect it from a distance. She simply looked at them the way she would look at any person she had just met and said, "Hello." Lily said hello back, quietly. Thomas said nothing. Caleb showed her the kitchen. It was a large kitchen with good bones and real problems. The stove was quality ironwork, but the firebox seal had cracked, and someone had been compensating by running it hotter than necessary, which explained the uneven cooking and the slightly scorched smell in the walls. The dry goods were stored with no system Maggie could identify. Flour and cornmeal in open sacks near the wall, which meant mice if they didn't have them already. 3 cast iron skillets, all seasoned at different rates, which told her different hands had been using them inconsistently. A butter churn that hadn't been used in some time. She did not say any of this out loud. She looked, took inventory in her head, and nodded. "What's the budget for provisions?" she asked. Caleb told her. It was workable. Tight in the winter months, but workable if she was careful. "And the cabin?" she said. He walked her out the back of the house across a short distance of cold yard to a small structure with its own stove and door. It was smaller than anything she'd lived in since she was a child, and it was clean, and it was hers, and she stood in the middle of it for a moment with that thought sitting in her chest like something warm. Hers. Not for long, maybe, but right now. "The position is yours if you want it," Caleb said from the doorway. He said it plainly, without sales pitch. "I'll be honest with you. The last 2 women I hired lasted less than a month. One found the isolation too much. The other had problems with Thomas." He paused. "He's not a bad kid. It's been a hard year." "Most people aren't bad," Maggie said. "They're just carrying something." He looked at her, that same look, not the traveling assessment, something more careful than that. "The pay is what the notice said," he told her. "First week to see if it suits. If it does, we talk about longer." "That's fair," Maggie said. She did not allow herself to feel too much. She had learned that lesson. Let hope in too wide and it wrecked you when the ground shifted. So she held it at a measured distance, just enough to keep her moving forward. She started the next morning. The first week at Rafter K was not beautiful. It was not the kind of thing that made a person feel they had arrived somewhere meaningful. It was hard, physical, unrelenting work in a house that had been running on minimum maintenance for long enough that catching it up required a kind of sustained effort that left Maggie falling into her cot at night before she could finish a thought. The firebox seal she fixed herself with mixed mortar, which meant the stove ran evenly for the first time in what she guessed was months, which meant the bread rose correctly, which meant at breakfast on the 4th day, Thomas ate 3 slices without being asked, and then looked up and found her watching and looked away like it hadn't happened. She set up the dry goods properly. Cloth-covered containers, labeled, elevated from the floor. She found the mouse evidence she'd expected, 2 corners in the storeroom, and set traps and sealed the gaps she could find and told Caleb about the gap under the south wall that needed proper repair before full winter. He got it repaired the following day. She noted that. She also noted that he was in the house very little during daylight hours. He was out with the ranch hands. There were 4 of them, ranging from a quiet, spare man named Hector, who had been at Rafter K the longest, to a young one named Dale, who was 17 and had the specific combination of capability and recklessness that belonged to young men who hadn't yet met the consequence that would slow them down. They worked the cattle, worked the fence lines, managed the 100 tasks that kept a working ranch operational. They came in for meals, ate, and went back out. They were polite to her, carefully polite, the kind of polite that keeps its distance while it decides what it thinks. Hector was the first one to say something real. He came in early one morning for coffee while she was working on the stove, and he stood at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and said, "Ma'am, That soup last night was the first hot meal that tasted like a real meal in longer than I want to count. Maggie handed him his coffee and said, "I'll take that." He nodded and went back out. Lily came into the kitchen on the third afternoon and sat at the corner of the table without asking permission, which told Maggie she had done it before with someone she trusted. She didn't say anything for a while, just sat there while Maggie worked. Then she said, "Can I watch?" "You can help if you want," Maggie said. Lily considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old weighing a significant decision. Then she got up and came to stand beside Maggie at the counter. Maggie showed her how to measure flour without packing it. She showed her how to tell by texture when a dough needed more water. She worked slowly and explained what she was doing without making it into a lesson, just narrating what her hands did the way you'd talk to yourself in an empty kitchen. Lily listened to everything. Thomas watched from the doorway for 11 minutes before walking away. Maggie kept her eyes on the dough. By the end of the second week, the rhythm of the house had changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a transformation, it was a subtle shift, the kind you notice only when you stop and compare. Meals were at consistent times. The kitchen ran cleanly. The smell of the house was different, wood smoke still, but underneath it something warmer. Bread and roasting meat and the herbs she had planted in 3 pots on the kitchen windowsill that got the afternoon light. The ranch hands had stopped being carefully polite and started being genuinely relaxed around her, which was its own kind of acceptance. Dale had tried once to be funny at her expense, something about how much pie a person could eat. And Hector had said quietly, "That's enough, Dale." And Dale had shut his mouth and not tried it again. Maggie had not reacted in the moment. Later, when she brought coffee out to the barn and handed Dale his cup, he took it and said, "Sorry, ma'am." And she said, "Drink it before it gets cold." And that was the end of it. She was not building approval. She had stopped needing approval the way she once had burned that need down somewhere in the second year of her marriage, when she understood that needing it too badly made you compromise things that shouldn't be compromised. But she was building something. She could feel it taking shape around her, slow and unspectacular and more solid than the fast kinds. Caleb had stopped being surprised by her competence, which she counted as progress. He was not easy to read. He was not cold, but he was contained in a way that felt habitual rather than natural, like a man who had decided at some point to keep himself behind a particular boundary and had been doing it for long enough that he'd forgotten it was a decision. I was fair to the ranch hands, patient with his children in the tired way of a man stretched too thin, and completely unequipped to talk about anything that wasn't practical and immediate. She had figured out within the first week that the question of his late wife was the locked room in the house. Nobody mentioned her name. Lily would sometimes start a sentence and then drift away from it. Thomas wore something around his neck on a cord. She caught a glimpse of it once, a small flat pendant, and whatever it was had clearly been his mother's because of the way he pressed it into his palm, sometimes when he thought no one was looking. Caleb kept a photograph on the mantel. She had dusted around it carefully without looking at it directly. The way you approach something you understand belongs to someone else. She did not push. She had no right to push. She was the cook and housekeeper, and she had enough of her own locked rooms without trying to force open anyone else's. Then she found the recipe book. It was in the back of the bottom cabinet in the kitchen, behind a tin of lard and 2 jars of preserved peaches that had been there long enough she couldn't guarantee the seals. A small book, maybe 30 pages, cloth covered in faded blue, the binding soft from handling. She picked it up and opened it and saw handwriting, careful, slightly rounded, the handwriting of someone who had learned it properly and then made it their own. She was going to close it and set it aside. Then she saw the word at the top of one of the pages. Apple. It was written above a recipe for apple cake, and the handwriting on this page was different from the entries around it, faster, less careful, the way people write when they're working from memory, and the hand is keeping up with the mind. And there was a note at the bottom of the recipe, small and tucked into the corner, that said, "From M. Granger, summer of 71. Maggie went very still. Summer of 1871. She had been 19. She had worked that summer at the Granger Hotel kitchen, her first real job after her mother died, the job that kept her fed while she figured out what came next. It had been a hard summer and a strange one, and she had made friends with a young woman who was passing through with her father, headed west to meet the man she was going to marry. a young woman with careful, rounded handwriting and a love of apple cake. Maggie stood in the kitchen with the recipe book in her hands and understood, with a quality of disorientation she had not felt in years, that she was standing in the house of a woman she had once known. The name on the inside cover of the book, in that careful hand, was Clara Whitmore, née Aldridge. Maggie sat down. She did not make the apple cake that day. She made it the following afternoon when Lily was in the kitchen and Thomas had come in from outside and was sitting at the table, supposedly working on figures for his school lessons, but actually mostly watching without meaning to. She made it from Clara's recipe, from the measurements and the notes and the small addition at the bottom that said, "More cinnamon than you think, less sugar than you want," which was the exact advice Maggie had given Clara in that hotel kitchen all those years ago, because Clara had a tendency to make things too sweet, and Maggie had told her so, and Clara had laughed and said she'd remember. She had remembered. The cake came out exactly as she had made it 35 years ago in that hotel kitchen, dense and warm and smelling of apple and spice in a way that was not quite like any other cake. It was specific. It was that recipe and no other. Caleb came in for supper and stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the cake on the counter. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful in a way she had not heard from him before. "Where did you get that recipe?" Maggie told him. She told him about the summer of 1871, about the hotel kitchen and the young woman passing through, about the recipe and the note, and recognizing the handwriting when she opened the book. He listened without interrupting. He was very still. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara never talked about a woman in Granger, not that I recall." "We only knew each other for a few weeks," Maggie said. "It was a long time ago." He nodded slowly. He looked at the cake again. Then he looked at Maggie. Really looked at her. Not the way he had been looking at her, which was the way you look at someone doing a job that needs doing. The way you look at a person. "Can I have a piece?" he said. She cut him one. He ate it standing at the counter, which was not how she usually served things, and he didn't seem to notice. He ate it slowly, and she watched him without being obvious about it, and saw the thing happen that she had known might happen. The memory arriving through the taste, through the particular specificity of that combination of apple and spice and the slightly uneven sweetness that was Clara's preference. Not perfect, but her own. His jaw tightened once. Then he put the plate down, said, "Thank you," and went outside. Lily looked at Maggie. "Did that make him sad?" she asked. "I think it made him remember," Maggie said. "That's not always the same thing as sad." Lily considered this. Then she asked if she could have a piece. Thomas had one too, though he served himself without asking, which Maggie chose to interpret as progress. That night, sitting alone in her cabin with her feet aching and the small stove ticking through its warmth, Maggie allowed herself to feel something she had been keeping at a distance since she arrived. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But something close to belonging. It was a fragile thing. She knew it was fragile. She had been in enough situations that felt solid right up until the moment they weren't to know better than to trust it too completely. But she let herself feel it anyway, carefully, the way you carry something that might break. Not clutching it so hard it shatters, not holding it so loosely it slips away. She was still holding it when she fell asleep. The morning after the apple cake, nothing was said about it. That was how Maggie knew it had mattered. If it hadn't mattered, Caleb would have mentioned it. The coincidence. The strange thread of connection between his late wife and the woman now running his kitchen. People talk about things that don't cost them anything. They go quiet about the things that do. He came in for breakfast, said good morning, sat down with his coffee, and ate the eggs and biscuits she put in front of him with the focused attention of a man who has decided to stay inside the practical boundaries of the day. Maggie did not push. She had her own way of processing things that surprised her, and it did not involve talking about them right away. She needed to carry them around for a while first, turn them over, understand their weight before she decided what to do with them. The connection to Clara was like that, strange and close and completely outside anything she could have planned for. It sat in her chest like a stone that was not quite painful but was not comfortable either. She washed the breakfast dishes and thought about coincidence and whether coincidence was the right word for it. Lily came in before school and asked if there was any of the apple cake left. There was not. Thomas had finished it the night before. She had heard him in the kitchen around 9 o'clock, the quiet, deliberate movements of a boy who didn't want to be caught wanting something. "We can make another," Maggie said. Lily's face did a complicated thing, pleasure at the prospect, and then something more careful underneath it. "Papa liked it," she said. "He didn't say so, but he had 2 pieces." "He had 3, Maggie said. Lily looked at her with the particular satisfaction of a child learning that adults are more legible than they pretend to be. "He doesn't usually eat dessert," she said. "I know." Lily picked up her schoolbook from the table and tucked it under her arm and paused at the door. "Miss Maggie," she said, and then stopped. "What?" "Nothing." She shook her head. "Never mind." And she went out. Maggie stood at the sink and listened to her footsteps cross the porch and go down into the yard, and she thought about the things children started to say and then pulled back from, and how often those were the truest things. The 3rd week brought the cold down off the mountains with real intention. It was the kind of cold that was not content to stay outside. It pressed at the window gaps, found the place where the back door didn't quite sit flush in its frame, turned the water in the washing basin to a thin skin of ice by morning. Maggie had grown up in cold country, and she did not fear it, but she respected it the way you respect anything with that kind of indifference to whether you survived it or not. She started the fires earlier. She added a 2nd layer of insulation to the storeroom wall using wool blankets and old canvas she found in the barn, which Hector told her was smarter than half the things that had been tried in previous winters. She made heavier food, stews that had been going most of the day, cornbread that came out dense and warm, a pot of bean soup that lasted 3 days and improved each time she reheated it. The ranch hands ate with the gratitude of men who had spent too many winters with inadequate cooking and knew the difference. Dale, who had been careful around her since the incident with the pie remark, had gradually relaxed into something more genuine. He was young enough to be transparent about most things, and old enough to be embarrassed by his transparency, which made him intermittently awkward, and then intermittently more honest than he intended. One afternoon he came in from a fence repair half frozen, and she put hot coffee and a bowl of soup in front of him without being asked, and he wrapped both hands around the bowl and said, "My ma used to do this." Maggie sat down across from him with her own coffee. "Where's your mother now?" she asked. "Kansas," he said. "She remarried. Good man. I didn't really fit anymore once he was there." He said this without self-pity, just as a fact he had organized himself around. "So I came west." "You're 17, Maggie said. 18 in March." She looked at him, this boy who was almost a man but not quite, eating soup in someone else's kitchen because he hadn't fit in his own home anymore. She recognized the specific quality of that particular displacement. Not the dramatic kind, not the thrown out into the street kind. The quieter kind, where you're not unwanted so much as surplus. And you know the difference, but it doesn't actually hurt less. "Eat the soup," she said. He did. The cold also brought something else, the first real test of Thomas. She had been patient with him in the way you're patient with something you can't rush. Not performing patience, just genuinely not pushing, letting him set the pace of whatever he was going to decide about her. He was not hostile. He was watchful and contained and occasionally capable of a dry observation that caught her off guard because it was smarter than she had expected, which meant she had been making assumptions she ought not to have been making. On a Thursday morning, the cold so severe that the barn animals were agitated by it, and Caleb and the hands were dealing with a fence section that had come down overnight under the ice weight, Thomas came into the kitchen and stood at the counter watching her make a 2nd round of breakfast biscuits for when the men came back in. He stood there for a while. Then he said, "You do it different than Mrs. Patterson." Mrs. Patterson, she had gathered, was the woman who had held the post before the last 2 short-term arrangements. She had been there for 2 years, apparently, and had left when her own family needed her elsewhere. "How did Mrs. Patterson do it?" Maggie asked. "She made them flat," Thomas said. "Yours come out higher. It's how you work the dough," Maggie said. "You don't want to overwork it, just enough to bring it together. Overworking makes them tough and flat." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Could I try?" She looked at him. He looked back, and there was something in his expression she recognized, the slight defensiveness of someone who has asked for something they half expect to be refused, not because they believe they deserve to be refused, but because they've been refused enough times that they've built the expectation into the request. Come here, she said. She showed him what she showed Lily. Not a lesson, just narrating what her hands did. She set him up with a portion of dough and let him work it. He was too deliberate at first, too careful, compensating for not knowing what he was doing by controlling too much. She told him to ease up. He frowned, then tried it, and she watched his hands change. Less grip, more feeling. And the dough responded, and he felt it respond, and something moved across his face that he immediately tried to neutralize. Better, she said, and turned back to her own work. He stood there finishing his portion. When he put the cut biscuits on the pan, they were not even different thicknesses, a couple of odd shapes, but they went into the oven with everything else and came out risen and warm, and when he bit into one, he did not say anything, but he ate the whole thing. He stayed in the kitchen for another hour that morning, doing figures at the table. He didn't talk. She didn't try to make him. But when he left, he said, "See you at supper," which was the first time he had said anything to her that was not a direct response to a direct question. She counted it. The gossip started the way. Gossip always started in small frontier towns, not with one voice, but with a current that moved through conversation the way cold moved through a cracked window frame. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Maggie heard the first version of it from Mrs. Eakins when she made the supply run into Granger on a Friday in mid-November. She was at the counter collecting the dry goods order when Mrs. Eakins leaned forward slightly and said, in the tone of someone who is about to say something they have decided to say because they think they're being helpful, "People are talking, Margaret." Maggie put her list flat on the counter. "What are they saying?" "That you've made yourself very comfortable out at the Whitmore place." She paused. "Some are saying you're angling." "Angling," Maggie repeated. "For the position, the permanent one." Mrs. Eakins said this delicately, the way you handle something you expect might break. "You understand what I mean." "I understand what you mean. I'm not saying I think that." Mrs. Eakins straightened, adjusting her position. "I'm saying that's the talk." Maggie looked at her for a moment. She felt the familiar thing. Not quite anger, not quite hurt, something in between that had its own particular temperature. Hot enough to matter, not hot enough to burn her judgment. "Do people think he's angling?" she asked. Mrs. Eakins blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Caleb Whitmore. Hired help is hired help. If there's something inappropriate happening, it involves two people. Do people say he's angling?" A pause. It's different, Margaret." "It's always different," Maggie said. She picked up her supply list and folded it. "Thank you for telling me." She loaded the supplies into the hired wagon and drove back to Rafter K and did not say anything about it to Caleb. What would she say? That the town had opinions. The town always had opinions. She had lived inside the range of those opinions for 15 years, and she knew their particular pattern. They tracked your every movement when you were a woman alone, looking for evidence of something unacceptable. And the evidence they looked for was shaped exactly like whatever you were doing. What she did not anticipate was how quickly the opinions would get colder. By December, she was hearing it secondhand in a different way, through the cautious phrasing of the ranch hands, the careful way. Hector said one evening that some of the families in town had been asking questions about the situation at Rafter K, and that he thought she ought to know people were watching. "Watching what?" Maggie said. Hector turned his coffee cup in his hands. He was a man of careful speech, not because he was slow, but because he had learned to be precise. "They see a woman of your circumstances," he said, "living on a widower's property, close to the house, cooking his meals, managing his children." He paused. "People make stories out of the material they have." "The material they have is a woman doing her job," Maggie said. "Yes," he said, "that's the material. But the story isn't about the material. It never is." She knew he was right. She had known it from the beginning, if she was honest, had felt it as a possibility the moment Mrs. Eakins had mentioned that nobody had taken the posting, that people talked. She had walked into this situation with her eyes open to the practical realities and had somehow not fully accounted for how quickly the social ones would sharpen. She lay in her cabin that night and thought about it with the kind of honesty she could only manage alone in the dark. She was not in love with Caleb Whitmore. That was the truth. And she stated it clearly to herself because she had spent enough of her life being imprecise about her own feelings, and she was too old and too tired for that now. She respected him. She had come to understand him better than she expected to. His silences and the shapes they made, The way he handled hard things, which was not always well, but was always genuinely. The fact that he loved his children in the clumsy, dedicated way of a man who had no model for it and was building the skill from scratch. What she felt for him was not nothing, but not what the town was imagining. What she felt for this house, for this work, for the particular rhythm that had grown around the 3 weeks she had been here. That was something harder to name and something she had to be more careful about, because it felt like home, and she had not had that in a long time. And she had learned that feeling like home and being home were different enough to break a person if they confused them. She pressed her palms flat against the cot and looked at the dark ceiling and told herself to be careful. December brought two things close together: a snowstorm that kept everyone inside for 3 days, and the first real argument between Maggie and Thomas. It started over something small, the way things that matter usually start. She had reorganized the supply shelves in the way she'd been meaning to do for weeks, which included moving a tin that had been sitting in the same spot since she arrived, which it turned out was the spot where Thomas had been keeping a specific item, a small glass jar with a piece of ribbon in it, tucked behind the tin in a place he apparently assumed nobody would touch. She had moved it to the counter when she cleared the shelf, and he came in and saw it there, and the look on his face was not simple anger. It was the look of someone who has just found something they had carefully hidden, standing exposed in the open. He picked it up and held it against his chest and said, with a control that was clearly costing him something, "You don't touch my things." "I didn't know it was there," Maggie said. "I wasn't going through your things. I was reorganizing the shelf." "That shelf is not yours," he said. "This kitchen is not yours. This house is not yours." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. He was braced for a fight. She could see it in his posture. The forward lean, the hands tight around the jaw set. He had said the thing, and now he was waiting for the response that would confirm something he believed about adults in his house who were not his mother and never would be. She did not give him that response. "You're right," she said. "I should have checked everything on the shelf before I moved it. I'm sorry I didn't." He blinked. "The ribbon is safe," she said. "It fell to the counter when I moved the tin. I set it there so it wouldn't get lost." He looked at the jar in his hands, then at the counter, then at her. "Was that the right place to put it?" she asked. "Or do you have somewhere better?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fight he had geared up for had not arrived, and he didn't quite know what to do with the absence of it. He shifted his weight, looked at the jar. "It's my mother's," he said. Finally. Not as an explanation, as the fact placed between them, carefully, the way you set down something breakable. "I know," Maggie said. She didn't. But she understood what it was, what the ribbon in the jar and the pendant on the cord around his neck and the careful avoidance of anything that touched his mother's memory in front of others all added up to. A boy who was grieving in private because private was the only place he'd found that was safe enough to do it in. "You don't know," he said, but the heat had gone out of it. "No," she agreed. "I don't. You're right about that too." He stood there for another moment. Then he said with an effort that was almost physical, I don't hate you. He stopped. "You don't have to explain it," Maggie said. "I'm not trying to be difficult." "Thomas." She waited until he looked at her. "You lost your mother. You're allowed to be difficult." His throat moved. He looked down at the jar. Then he put it in his coat pocket, where it sat against his chest the same way the pendant did, and walked out of the kitchen. He did not slam the door. She stood at the counter and let out a slow breath and went back to the shelves. An hour later, he came back and said, "What's for supper?" "Venison stew," she said. "That's good," he said, with the studied casualness of a 13-year-old trying to sound like none of the previous hour had happened. "Hector said it was cold enough to freeze the water trough." "He's right," Maggie said. "Tell him I'll have extra coffee ready at 5. "Okay," Thomas said. He went to the table and sat down with his school book. She went back to the stove and did not let him see her face for a moment, because the expression on it was one she didn't want to explain. The snowstorm came 3 days after that and settled over Rafter K like a deliberate pause. Everything outside shut down. The horizon collapsed to white. The world reduced to the space between the house and the barn and the small matter of keeping everything alive inside both. It was 3 days of enforced proximity. The ranch hands bunked in the barn through the worst of it. Caleb and the children and Maggie were in the main house, And what Maggie discovered in those 3 days was that a family in a small space reveals things that regular life keeps hidden. Caleb, without the ranch to manage, was quieter in a different way. Not the contained, practical quiet of a man with work to do, but the deeper, less directed quiet of someone who didn't quite know what to do with himself when the structure was removed. He was not idle. He found tasks, repaired 2 hinges, worked through a stack of correspondence he'd been ignoring, spent time going over the ranch accounts. But he moved through these things with a restlessness underneath them, a searching quality that Maggie recognized as someone who felt more comfortable with external demands than internal ones. She did not point this out. On the second evening, with the storm still pressing hard against the shutters, Lily had fallen asleep in the armchair by the fire with a book open on her lap, and Thomas was stretched out on the floor with a dog that had appeared at the ranch sometime in October and been unofficially adopted, and Caleb was sitting at the table with papers he was no longer actually reading. Maggie was at the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea, watching the fire and thinking about nothing in particular. Caleb said, "How did you learn to cook?" She looked over at him. He was not looking at the papers. "My mother," she said. "She died when I was 18. Before that, I learned from her." "Was she a good cook?" "She was an excellent cook," Maggie said. "She was also a difficult woman in most other respects, which made it complicated. But she could cook." He turned his cup in his hands. "Clara was not a natural cook," he said. "It came out simply, without ceremony, the kind of statement that's been waiting inside someone for a while, biding its time for a moment when it might be bearable to release it. She was good at other things. She learned what she needed to learn, and she made it work. But it wasn't... She didn't love it the way you do." Maggie looked at him. "I didn't know you'd noticed." "Hard to miss," he said. "You fix things without being asked to fix them. You see what's needed. It's not a skill you can teach someone. Either you have it or you don't." He paused. "She had it with people. She could walk into a room and understand what everyone needed before they said it. I never had that." "You're doing all right," Maggie said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I'm managing," he said, "which is what I've been doing for the past year and a half. Managing." He looked at Lily asleep in the chair. "They need more than managed. I know that. I'm just..." He stopped, shook his head. "You're doing it alone," Maggie said. "That's different from not doing it." He looked at her then, and there was something in the look that she couldn't entirely decode, some combination of things she did not let herself interpret too freely, because she had promised herself the night she lay in the dark, counting the ways this situation could go wrong, that she would be careful about exactly this kind of moment. "The storm should break by tomorrow morning," she said, and went back into the kitchen. Done. By February, the rhythm at Rafter K had become something Maggie had stopped bracing herself against. That was the real change. Not the outward one, not the meals at consistent times, and the clean house and the children doing better, all of which was visible and noted by the handful of people who came out to the ranch on necessary business. The real change was internal. She had stopped expecting to be removed. She had stopped calibrating every action against the question of how long she had before this ended. She did not know when exactly it had happened. These things didn't happen on a particular day. They accumulated, slow and mostly invisible, until one morning you realized you had stopped running the calculation. Lily had begun teaching her things, which was the reverse of how it had started and said something important about how far they had come. She was teaching Maggie the names of the horses. Rafter K had 6, each with a distinct personality that Lily explained with the precision of someone who has been paying close attention. And she was teaching her which plants along the south fence came up edible in early spring and which ones only looked like they did. Lily had absorbed this from somewhere, probably her mother, and she shared it with the particular seriousness of a child who understands that what she carries is worth carrying. Thomas had begun talking to her in actual paragraphs. Not always, not every day, but the careful rationing of words had started to loosen, and what came through in the unguarded moments was a person Maggie was genuinely interested in, sharp and somewhat sardonic, and carrying a weight of internal loyalty that ran deep enough that it had been his greatest obstacle and might someday be his greatest strength. I was protective of the things he loved and had not yet learned to tell the difference between protection and prevention, which was a lesson that couldn't be taught, only lived. He had started bringing his schoolwork to the kitchen in the evenings. He told her it was quieter than the front room when Lily was in there. This was not true. Lily was generally the quieter one, but she accepted the explanation and did not argue with it. One evening in February, he sat at the table working on a reading passage and looked up and said, "This writer uses too many words." Maggie looked up from the bread she was shaping. "Which writer?" He held up the book. She crossed to read the passage he was pointing at. He was right. It was the particular over-elaborated style of a man writing to demonstrate his vocabulary rather than tell his story, and the story suffered for it. "He doesn't trust the reader," Maggie said. Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" "He explains too much because he doesn't trust you to understand without the extra words. A writer who trusts you leaves some of the work for you to do. It makes the reading better. You're part of it, not just receiving it." Thomas looked at the passage again. Yeah, he said slowly. "That's what it is. It feels like being talked at." "Exactly." He went back to the passage with a different expression. Not a student grudgingly completing an assignment, but a person who had been given a tool and was applying it. He underlined the sentences that did it worst. He annotated in the margin. He was still there when Caleb came in for the evening coffee, and Caleb looked at him bent over the book and then at Maggie, and she just raised her eyebrows slightly and turned back to the stove. Caleb poured his own coffee without being asked, which was new. He sat down at the far end of the table and opened the ranch accounts, and they all three sat there in the kitchen with the lamp warm above them, and the cold doing its work outside, and something that was so close to ordinary it almost went unnoticed. Almost. Maggie noticed. She noticed it and then very deliberately went back to what she was doing, because she had learned that looking at these moments too directly made them self-conscious and fragile. Better to hold them in peripheral vision, better to let them be what they were without insisting on knowing what they meant. The bread went in the oven. Thomas said something quietly to himself about the writer with too many words. Caleb turned a page. Outside, the February wind moved across the ranch and around the house, and the barn, and the small cabin that Maggie slept in, and was careful about calling home, even in the privacy of her own mind. She was still being careful when Victor Hale's letter arrived. She didn't know it was his letter. She didn't know who Victor Hale was. She saw Caleb read it at the kitchen table one morning in early March, saw the way his posture changed as he read, something closing off in his shoulders, the way a shutter closes, and she set down the coffee pot and went back to her work without asking. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. He didn't say anything about it for 2 days. On the third day, Hector came in looking for her specifically, which he didn't do, and he told her quietly at the kitchen door that Clara Whitmore's brother was coming to Rafter Cay for a visit. "Victor Hale," he said. "He's been in contact with the ranch before, after Mrs. Whitmore passed." He paused. "He has opinions." "About what?" Maggie said. Hector's expression did the thing it did when he was choosing his words. "About the way the ranch is being managed, about the children, about—" He stopped. "About people at the ranch." "About me," Maggie said. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She stood at the kitchen door in the cold morning air and let that settle, let it find the shape it needed to take. Victor Hale. Clara's brother. A man who had opinions about a woman he had never met, working at a ranch he didn't own, in a situation he had heard about only through the same gossip channels that had been running for months. She thought about the 9 weeks she had spent building something here, the firebox she had fixed, the meals she had made, the way Thomas now said, "See you at supper," and the way Lily had showed her the edible plants along the south fence, and the way Caleb had poured his own coffee and sat at the table and turned pages while the bread baked. She thought about how none of that was visible to a man arriving by stage from wherever Victor Hale lived with whatever picture he had already drawn. "When is he coming?" she said. "End of the week," Hector said. She went back inside and started the morning biscuits and told herself that 9 weeks of solid work was worth more than one man's opinion. Told herself this with the conviction of someone who needed to believe it, which was not quite the same as simply believing it. She was still telling herself that when Friday came. Victor Hale arrived on a Friday afternoon when the sky had the particular gray of a Montana winter that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to snow or simply threaten it all day. Maggie heard the horse before she saw the man. She was in the kitchen starting the early preparations for supper, a venison roast that needed several hours, when the sound of hooves came across the yard with the particular purposefulness of someone who knew where they were going and had already decided what they thought about it when they got there. She did not go to the window. She heard Caleb cross the front room and open the door, heard voices she couldn't make out, heard boots on the porch steps. She kept working. She was putting the roast into the Dutch oven when the front door opened and the voices became clear, and she heard Caleb say, "Victor, it's been a while," in the tone of a man who means the opposite of what sounds welcoming about those words. And then a different voice, educated, considered, with the particular smoothness of someone who had spent years being listened to in rooms that rewarded certain registers over others. "It has. The place looks well enough. From the outside." A pause. Then the sound of movement into the front room. Then footsteps toward the kitchen. Maggie was at the stove when Victor Hale appeared in the kitchen doorway, and she had one moment of preparation before he spoke. One moment to see him and take his measure before he took hers. He was perhaps 50, well built in the way of men who had once been physically active and had since converted that into a different kind of presence. His coat was good. His boots were good. His face was the face of a man who was accustomed to walking into situations and rearranging them according to his own sense of proper order. He looked at the kitchen, at the organized shelves, the working stove, the roast going into the oven, the pots of herbs on the windowsill, and then he looked at Maggie. That look. She had been looked at that way so many times she could read it the way other people read text. The traveling assessment, top to bottom, the slight recalibration of assumptions, the moment where the conclusion arrives and settles into the eyes before anything is said. She put the lid on the Dutch oven and turned to face him directly. "You must be Mr. Hale," she said. "I'm Margaret Holloway. Supper will be at 6. It was a small thing, giving her name before he could ask for it, setting the time for the meal as though it were information and not positioning. But Victor Hale was a man who noticed small things, and she knew it from the way his expression shifted just slightly, adjusting. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I've heard about you." "I imagine so," Maggie said. He looked around the kitchen again. Then he nodded, once, and went back into the front room. Caleb appeared in the doorway a moment later. He looked at her with something she couldn't entirely read. Apology was part of it, and warning was part of it, and something else underneath both of those that she didn't spend time trying to identify. "He'll be staying through Sunday," Caleb said. "I'll make up the East Room," she said. He nodded and went back to his guest. "Well, supper that evening had the quality of a meal where everyone at the table is aware that the conversation is a performance of something other than what it appears to be." Victor Hale was gracious in the technical sense of the word. He said the right things about the food. He engaged Lily with the particular attention adults deploy when they want to appear interested in children while being interested in something else entirely. And he asked Thomas questions about his schoolwork and nodded at the answers. He spoke to Caleb about the ranch, about the cattle prices, about the state of the north fence line that had been giving them trouble all winter. Maggie served and moved around the table and did not participate in the conversation, which was normal. She was the housekeeper, not a guest. But she listened because listening was what she did. What she heard beneath the surface of the conversation was the shape of what Victor Hale had come to do. He was not here for a visit. He was here to take inventory. She could hear it in the questions he asked Caleb, specific, slightly leading, the questions of a man building a case rather than a man making conversation. How was the ranch doing financially? How were the children managing their schooling? Did Caleb find it difficult managing everything alone? That last one, delivered over the apple pie Lily had helped Maggie make that afternoon. With a tone of concern that was so carefully constructed, Maggie almost missed the architecture of it. "I imagine having reliable help makes an enormous difference," Victor said. He glanced at Maggie briefly. "Though I understand turnover has been an issue." "Not recently," Caleb said. "No," Victor agreed and said nothing further, which was its own kind of statement. Lily looked between the two men with the sharp attention of a child who understands emotional weather without having the vocabulary for it yet. Thomas was looking at his plate with an expression Maggie recognized, the studied neutrality of a boy who has decided to wait before deciding what to do with what he's hearing. After supper, after the children had gone to their rooms and Maggie had cleared the dishes, she could hear Caleb and Victor in the front room. She was not trying to overhear them. But the house was not large, and Victor Hale's voice, when he dropped the social register, was not quiet. She heard him say Clara's name, and then, "She deserves better than to have her house managed by someone like that." She stopped at the kitchen sink. Caleb's response was lower and she couldn't make it out. Then Victor again. "I'm not suggesting anything improper is happening. I'm suggesting the impression it creates. This town talks, Caleb. And the way people talk about this arrangement reflects on Clara's children, whether you intend it to or not." A long pause. "She's good with them," Caleb said. She could make this out because he had moved, or because something in his voice had risen to carry the weight of the words. "Better than anyone we've had." "I don't doubt her competence," Victor said. "That's not the question." Maggie put the last dish away and went out to her cabin. She sat on her cot in the cold and held her hands together in her lap and looked at the small stove and let herself feel it. The specific quality of this particular kind of diminishment, which was not the blunt kind, not the overt kind, not the kind that called you stupid or useless or incapable. This was the kind that accepted your value and then made that value irrelevant, that said, yes, she is good at this. But look at her and let the shape of that sentence do the rest of the work. Not the question. She had been the wrong question her whole life. Too much of one thing, not enough of another, the wrong size, the wrong circumstances, the wrong presentation of a person who was, underneath all of it, competent and steady and capable of more than most people in those rooms would ever bother to find out. She sat there for a long time. Then she went to sleep, because tomorrow she had bread to start before dawn and a house to open up and work that needed doing, regardless of Victor Hale's opinions about who was doing it. Saturday began with Lily at the kitchen door before Maggie had finished the first coffee. The girl had a look on her face that was a child's version of her father's contained expression, something being held in place by effort. She came to the counter and stood there while Maggie worked, and after a while she said, "I don't like him." Maggie looked at her. "Victor?" "He looks at you like you're a problem," Lily said. "He looked at the kitchen like he was looking for something wrong." "He didn't find anything," Maggie said. "I know," Lily said. "That made him look harder." Maggie stopped what she was doing. She looked at this girl who was 8 years old and had already learned to read the room in a way that took most adults decades to develop, if they developed it at all. "Your uncle has concerns," Maggie said carefully, "about the ranch, about how things look to people in town. Those aren't... He's not wrong to have them. He just has a particular way of addressing them." "He's not my uncle," Lily said. "He's my mother's brother. That's different." Maggie absorbed this distinction, which was precise and said something about how Lily organized the world. "He didn't come to see us," Lily continued. "He came to see what he could say about us." "Lily, it's true," she said, not defensively, just as a statement. "Thomas thinks so too." Thomas, in Maggie's experience, was rarely wrong about the subtext of adult behavior, even when he was wrong about other things. She said, "Your father can handle Victor Hale. Your job is your schoolwork." Lily looked unconvinced, which was appropriate because Maggie was not entirely convinced either. Yeah. The collision happened on Saturday afternoon. It was not a dramatic entrance. Victor Hale simply came into the kitchen at a time when Maggie was the only one in it, and he did not come with obvious hostility. That would have been easier to deal with. He came with the manner of a man who had decided to be reasonable, which in Maggie's experience was more dangerous than open antagonism because it put the unreasonableness on the other side of any pushback. He sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "I think we should have a direct conversation." "All right," Maggie said. She did not sit down. She stayed at the counter, which meant she had her back partially to him while she worked, which was not ideal but was better than stopping entirely. "I want you to understand that my concerns are not personal," he began. She had heard that opening before. "Of course," she said. "Clara's children are my only remaining connection to my sister," he said. "Their well-being, their reputation, their standing in this community matters to me more than perhaps anything else in my life." He said this sincerely. That was the thing that made him more difficult than a simple obstacle. She believed it. He was not lying about caring for the children. The caring was real. The conclusions he'd drawn from it were wrong, but the root was genuine, which meant there was no clean place to push back against. "I understand that," Maggie said. "Then you understand that the situation at this ranch, the way it appears to people in Granger and the surrounding area, creates problems for those children that will follow them for years." "With respect, Mr. Hale, Maggie said, keeping her voice even. The thing creating problems for the children in this community is the willingness of adults to make a story out of a woman doing a job. A pause. That may be true in principle, he said, but you and I both know the world doesn't operate on principle. Then the solution is to change the adults who are doing the talking, not to remove the woman doing the job. That is an admirable position, he said, and the slight lift at the end of it told her what he thought of admirable positions that failed to account for practical reality. But it isn't a solution. A solution is something that actually resolves the problem. What I'm suggesting, what I would ask you to consider, is whether your presence here is ultimately in the best interest of these children, regardless of the quality of your work. The kitchen was very quiet. Maggie put down the knife she had been using on the onions and turned to face him directly. You're asking me to leave, she said. I'm asking you to consider it. Those are the same question. He met her eyes. He did not look away, which she credited him for. He was not a coward, Victor Hale. I was something more aggravating than a coward, a man who had decided he was right and had arrived at that decision by a route that was sincere enough to protect him from most challenges to it. I've spent 3 months putting this house back together, Maggie said. Those children, both of them, were struggling in ways that had nothing to do with cooking and cleaning and everything to do with needing someone stable in their lives. Thomas is doing his schoolwork again. He's sleeping through the night again. Lily isn't afraid of the dark anymore. That's not because of me specifically. It's because someone stayed long enough to matter. Victor listened. She had to give him that. And in another 6 months, she continued, when the town has moved on to something else to talk about, those children will still need that. If I leave now, the pattern continues. The help comes and goes, and they learn that people leave, which is the last thing they need to be learning after losing their mother. Victor was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this carefully, he said. I live here, Maggie said. I think about it every day. He clasped his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up and said, Mrs. Holloway, I don't question your investment in this family. I question the wisdom of allowing that investment to grow in a direction that will create greater problems than it solves. The talk in Granger is not gentle, and Caleb is not a man who is well equipped to handle social consequences. He never was. He will make decisions to manage the immediate discomfort that will cost him more than he anticipates. Something cold and specific moved through her at those words. Not because of what they said about her. She had already processed most of what could be said about her. Because of what they predicted about Caleb. And because she was not entirely sure Victor Hale was wrong. That evening, Caleb found her in the kitchen after supper when the children were in bed and Victor had retired to the east room. He stood in the doorway with his coffee, and he looked like a man who had been carrying a conversation in his head all day and had not yet found the right way to put it down. He talked to you, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. He did, Maggie said. Caleb nodded. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table. He turned the coffee cup. It was a habit she had noticed, something he did when he was working out how to say something that mattered. What did he say? Caleb asked. She told him. Not all of it, but the core of it. That Victor had concerns about how the arrangement appeared to the community, that he believed her presence was creating reputational problems for the children, that he had suggested she consider leaving. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. What did you tell him? He said. What I believed, Maggie said. That removing me solves the wrong problem. He nodded again, slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something that had layers he needed to work through. She waited. He's not an easy man, Caleb said finally. He wasn't easy when Clara was alive. He has strong ideas about how things should be. I noticed that, Maggie said. He loves those kids, Caleb said. It came out like something he'd needed to say out loud to remind himself it was true. In his way. He's wrong about a lot of things, but that part is genuine. I know, Maggie said. He looked at her. You're not going to make this easy for me, are you? What would easy look like? She said. You agreeing with him, packing up, making the problem go away. That would be easy for you, she said. It wouldn't be right. He made the not quite a laugh sound. No, he said. It wouldn't. He was quiet. The lamp on the table made his face half shadow, half amber. I told Victor that how I manage my ranch and my household is my business. Something settled in her chest. How did he take that? About as well as you'd expect. Caleb looked at the table. He's leaving Sunday. He said what he came to say. Whether I listen is, as he put it, my own affair. She nodded. But he'll go back to Granger, Caleb said, and he'll talk. He was talking before he came, Maggie said. It'll get louder, Caleb said. I want you to know that. I don't have any intention of asking you to leave, but I'm not naive about what's coming. She looked at him across the kitchen in the lamplight and thought about how different this was from what she had expected when she walked down that ridge in November. Not simpler, but different, the complexity of a different kind. Not the complexity of being unwanted, the complexity of mattering in a situation where mattering was not without cost. I appreciate that, she said. He nodded, stood, put his cup in the wash basin. Get some sleep, he said, and went to his room. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes after he left, in the quiet house with the fire burning low and the wind doing its constant work against the shutters, and she thought about mattering and cost and the specific calculation a person makes when they decide whether something is worth what it's going to take out of them. She was still doing that math when she went to bed. Victor Hale left on Sunday morning, precisely when he said he would. He shook Caleb's hand. He told the children he would write. He looked at Maggie once, at the kitchen door, and said, "You make a good apple cake, Mrs. Holloway," which was either a concession or a parting shot, and she was never quite sure which. She watched his horse go up the track and over the ridge. Then she went back inside and started the Sunday meal. What she did not anticipate, what none of them anticipated, was how fast his return to Granger would move the temperature of things. Within a week, she felt it on the supply run. The quality of the quiet in the dry goods store. The way two women she passed on the boardwalk didn't quite make eye contact. The transaction at the feed store that was 2 beats faster than usual, the man behind the counter suddenly very interested in his ledger. She came back to Rafter K and said nothing about it. But Caleb heard things too. Ranch business brought him into town twice that month, and he came back both times with the tight jaw and the extra quiet that meant something had been said that he was processing rather than sharing. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. They moved around it the way you move around something on the floor in the dark, knowing it's there, choosing your steps accordingly. The children felt it without understanding it. Lily came home from school one afternoon in mid-March and went straight to the kitchen and sat at the corner of the table with her school book open in front of her but not reading it. And when Maggie set milk and bread down next to her, she said, "Emma Parcher said her mother says you shouldn't be here." Maggie sat down. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said Emma Parcher's mother has never been to our house," Lily said, with a precision that was so exactly right that Maggie had to be careful with her own expression. "That was a good answer," Maggie said. "Was it true? What she said?" Maggie was quiet for a moment. She had a policy about not lying to children, not because of any rigid principle, but because children always found out, and when they found out, the lie became the story rather than the truth it had been covering. "Some people in town are uncomfortable with the arrangement here," she said. "A woman living on a ranch with a widower. It looks a certain way to certain people." "But you're the housekeeper," Lily said. "I know that. You know that. But people who've never been here don't know that. They know what they imagine." Lily considered this. "That seems like their problem," she said. "It is their problem," Maggie said. "The difficulty is that it becomes our problem when they talk about it loudly enough." Lily absorbed this. She looked at her milk. Then she said, "Are you going to leave?" "No," Maggie said. Lily looked up at her with the directness of a child who has been lied to before and knows the particular quality of a lie delivered with confidence. She looked for a long moment. Then she nodded and opened her schoolbook. That evening, Thomas came to Maggie before supper in a way that was deliberate. He had clearly been waiting for a moment when they were alone, and said simply, "The thing people are saying in town, it's not fair." "No," Maggie said, "it isn't." "Is my father going to let it matter?" She looked at him carefully. I was asking her to tell him the truth about his father, which was either a mark of trust in her or a sign that he had doubts he didn't know where else to put. "Your father is a fair man," she said. "He has his own way of handling pressure, and it isn't always immediate. But he's fair." Thomas looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he went to set the table, which she had not asked him to do, but which needed doing. The letter arrived in the last week of March. It was addressed to Caleb, and it was from Victor Hale, and Maggie knew this because Caleb left it open on the kitchen table when he went out to the barn one morning, and she saw the handwriting and the return address before she looked away. She did not read it, but she saw enough. The tone of the opening visible on the top of the page, and a phrase near the middle that she caught without meaning to. The children standing in this community and their mother's memory. Caleb came back in and took the letter off the table without saying anything about it. That afternoon he asked her to come into the front room. She followed him and stood near the fireplace and waited. He stood at the window with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the yard. Then he turned around, and his face had the expression she had been bracing against since the night Victor Hale arrived. The expression of a man who has made a decision that he knows is wrong and is going to make it anyway, because the pressure of not making it has become more than he has the capacity to hold. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I need you to understand that this is not what I want." She knew then. She had known it was possible since the night in February when she sat on her cot and thought about mattering and cost. Since the conversation with Victor in the kitchen, since the tightened jaw on Caleb's supply run returns. She had known it was possible, and she had not let herself believe it would arrive. It arrived anyway. "The situation," he said, and then stopped. Tried again. "People in town. Victor has connections with people who do business with the ranch. He's been making it known that the arrangement here is." He pressed his mouth flat. "He says that if it continues, he intends to speak to Judge Parcher about the children's welfare." "He's threatening custody," Maggie said. "Not formally. Not yet. But the implication is—" "I understand the implication." Caleb looked at her, and his expression was complicated in a way that would have taken her a long time to fully account for. Regret was there, and frustration at himself, and the particular misery of someone who knows they are about to do a thing they will not respect themselves for. "I need to ask you to—" "I know what you're asking," she said. He stopped. "You're asking me to leave." The fire made small sounds in the silence. Outside, somewhere in the yard, one of the horses moved, and the sound of it came through the window glass, thin and distant. "I don't have—" he started. "You don't have a better option," she said. "I know." Maggie. It was the first time he had used her first name without the formality of Mrs. Holloway, and she noticed it, the way she noticed everything in this house, and she put it somewhere careful inside herself because this was not the time for it. "I'll be ready by morning," she said. He said nothing. What was there to say? He had made the decision, and she had accepted it with less fight than she felt, because the fight inside her was not something she was going to spend on a man who had just proven that the pressure of other people's opinions could overwrite his own better judgment. She went back to the kitchen and finished the supper she had been making, because the bread was in the oven and the stew was on the heat, and the children needed to eat regardless of what the adults in their lives were doing. She served the meal. She ate with them for what she did not allow herself to think of as the last time. She washed the dishes. And then she went to her cabin and sat on her cot and felt the full, unmediated weight of it. Not dramatic, not operatic, just the plain and exhausted weight of a woman who had built something real and been told once again that real was not the right kind. She had spent her whole life being told she was not enough. And the worst part, the part that sat like a stone at the very bottom of everything, was that some part of her had walked into Rafter K already knowing it would end this way, and had stayed anyway, had stayed and built and cared and let herself belong, because the alternative was to stop staying anywhere at all. And she was not yet willing to become that woman. She was not willing yet. She started to pack. She packed slowly. Not because she was stalling. She had made her peace with the decision, or something close enough to peace that she could function inside it. But because packing slowly was the honest version of what she was doing, which was saying goodbye to a place without using the word. The cabin was small enough that packing it didn't take long regardless. Her clothes, her mother's sewing kit, the one thing she had carried through every move since she was 18. A small tin of dried herbs she had brought from Granger and never used because the kitchen windowsill herbs had grown better than she expected. The recipe book she had been keeping in her own hand, not Clara's, her own, the one she had started the second week at Rafter K to keep track of what worked with this stove, this altitude, these particular ingredients. She paused on that one. It was not hers, technically. She had bought the blank book with her own money and filled it with her own observations. But it was about this kitchen, and leaving it felt like leaving part of the work she had done. Keeping it felt like taking something that belonged here. She put it on the small shelf by the door. She would decide in the morning. She sat on the edge of the cot with her hands in her lap and the lamp burning low and the night outside doing its quiet Montana work. Wind moving through the pine stands on the ridge, the occasional shift and settle of the barn animals, the vast indifferent dark pressing against the cabin walls. She had slept well in this cabin, better than she had slept anywhere in the 2 years since Roy died, which was information she turned over once and then set aside because there was nothing practical to do with it. She was still sitting there when she heard the footstep on the cabin step. Not Caleb's footstep. She had learned the weight and rhythm of everyone on this ranch over 5 months, the way you learn the particular sounds of a house you live in, involuntarily and completely. This was lighter. She stood up and opened the door before whoever it was could knock. Lily. She was in her nightgown with a coat pulled over it, her dark hair loose, her feet in boots she hadn't laced. Her face in the lamplight had a quality Maggie had not seen on it before. Not the careful containment, not the studied adultness the girl reached for when she was managing something hard. Just the face itself. Open and young and frightened in the specific way of a child who has run out of strategies. "You're leaving," Lily said. "Come inside," Maggie said. "It's cold." Lily came in and stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at the suitcase and the trunk sitting open and half full. She looked at them for a long moment. "He asked you to go," she said. Maggie sat back down on the cot and said, "Sit down, Lily." Lily sat beside her, close, the way she had stopped doing after the first few weeks when she had relaxed enough to give herself more space. The closeness now was not habitual, it was deliberate. "It's complicated," Maggie said. "I know it's complicated," Lily said, with a sharpness that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it. "I know about Victor and the judge and the things people say in town. I'm not stupid." "I know you're not stupid," Maggie said. "Then don't say it's complicated like that means I shouldn't understand it." Maggie looked at her. This 8-year-old who had been made older than she should have been by the years she had lived through, who understood more about the mechanics of adult pressure than any child ought to, who had learned to read rooms and silences and the things people didn't say because she'd had to. "You're right," Maggie said. "Victor made threats. Your father is trying to protect you and Thomas from a situation that could make your lives harder." "By making them harder right now," Lily said. Maggie was quiet. "You think he's wrong," Lily said. "I think he's making the best decision he can with the information and the fear he has," Maggie said carefully. "That's not the same as right." Lily stared at the floor for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, pressed together the same way Maggie's often were when she was holding something in. The similarity of it caught in Maggie's chest. Then Lily said, in a voice that had gone quiet and careful, "You don't remind me of my mother because you look like her, or cook like her, or anything like that." Maggie waited. "You remind me of her because when you're in the house feels like someone is in it." She said this slowly, as though she was finding the words for something she had been carrying without language for. After she died, the house it was just a place. People came in and out and did things and left, and it felt like that. Like a place things happened in. Not a home. She swallowed. When you came, it started feeling like a home again. That's why. The lamp made small sounds. The wind moved outside. Maggie could not speak for a moment. Not because she was performing emotion, but because the actual thing was sitting in her throat, taking up the space words needed. "Lily," she said finally. "She would have liked you," Lily said. "My mother. She liked people who were honest and didn't fuss about things and did what needed doing." She looked up at Maggie. "She would have liked you a lot." Maggie put her arm around the girl's shoulders, which was something she had not done before, had been careful about the boundaries of warmth in this house, careful not to reach for things that might be misread or might cost the children something if she left. And she was leaving. But she put her arm around Lily anyway because some moments were more important than the carefulness that usually governed them. They sat like that for a while. Then there was another sound on the cabin step. Heavier this time. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He was dressed, not in nightclothes, but in his regular clothes, which meant he had not been to bed, which meant he had known or suspected something was happening and had stayed awake waiting for it. He looked at Lily, and then at Maggie, and then at the open trunk. He came inside and stood near the shelf by the door, which was where the recipe book sat, and he looked at it, and then at her. "You're actually going," he said. "Your father asked me to," Maggie said. Thomas's jaw tightened. "He's wrong." "Thomas?" "He is," he said. Not loud, not dramatic, just flat and sure. The statement of someone who has decided something and is done discussing its edges. He's doing what Victor wants because Victor scared him, and that's not the same as being right. It's more complicated than— "You were going to say complicated again," Thomas said. "Don't." Maggie stopped. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that had not been there the day she arrived, or for most of the months after. An openness she had watched him construct the wall against, and then slowly, cautiously, begin to allow past the wall in specific and controlled amounts. The wall was down now. Not because he'd chosen to lower it, but because the thing happening in this cabin was more important than the protection it provided. "You're the first person since my mother died who helped me actually understand what I was feeling," he said. "Not manage it, not get through it, understand it." He said this without looking away from her, which cost him something. She could see it costing him. "The day you told me I was allowed to be difficult. Do you remember that?" "I remember," she said. "I'd been waiting for someone to say that for a year and a half," he said. "Not someone to tell me it would be okay. Not someone to tell me to be brave. Just that I was allowed to feel what I felt." He pressed his mouth flat the way his father did. "And now he's sending you away because Victor Hale is worried about how things look." The three of them were quiet in the small cabin. Then Thomas said, "I'm going to talk to him." "Thomas, it won't— I'm going to talk to him," he said again, and went out. Lily looked at Maggie. Maggie looked at the door Thomas had left open, the cold coming through it. She got up and closed it and stood for a moment with her hand on the latch, and thought about what was happening in the main house right now, and whether she should go intervene, and what intervening would even look like, and whether it would make anything better or just add another layer to something that was already too complex for the hour. She decided to let it run. She sat back down next to Lily and said, "How long has Thomas known about Victor's threats?" "Since the letter came," Lily said. "He read it." "The letter your father left on the table." "Papa leaves things on the table when he's distracted. Thomas reads everything." She said this without judgment, just as fact. "He didn't tell me right away. He waited to see what Papa would do. And when he found out what your father did, he went very quiet," Lily said. "That's worse than when he's loud. When he's quiet like that, he's deciding something." Maggie thought about the boy who had come into her kitchen in December demanding she not touch his things, who had made biscuits with uneven thickness and eaten them without admitting they were good, who had started bringing his schoolwork to the kitchen in the evenings for reasons he would never state directly, but which she had understood perfectly. She thought about what it had cost him to say what he'd said just now. "He'll be all right," Maggie said, mostly to herself. "I know," Lily said. "He's strong. He just doesn't always know what to do with it." She did not know how long Thomas was in the main house. She and Lily sat in the cabin, and Lily eventually leaned against her side, and Maggie felt the girl's breathing slow, and she understood that she had fallen asleep, the sheer exhaustion of the day and the emotion of the night catching up with the child's body even as her mind had been running at full speed. Maggie sat still and did not move for a long time, because waking a sleeping child felt like a crime, and because she needed the stillness herself. The lamp burned down. She was sitting in the near dark when she heard boots on the cabin step again, and the door opened, and it was Caleb. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with Lily asleep against her shoulder, and his face in the dim light had an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the contained practical face, not the careful in grief face, not the managing everything face. Something else. Something that looked, on a man who had spent 18 months behind careful distances, distinctly like a person arriving somewhere after a very long road. He looked at Lily for a moment, then at Maggie. Then he sat down on the floor of the cabin, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and said nothing for a while. He did this with the manner of someone who has surrendered a fight, not lost it exactly, but chosen to stop prosecuting it. "He came in and stood in the front room," Caleb said, his voice low so as not to wake Lily. "And he just looked at me. Thomas. He stood there for about 30 seconds, not saying anything, and I thought he was going to explode or run or I didn't know. And then he said, "You taught me to not let other people tell me what something is worth." And then he went to bed. Maggie said nothing. 10 words, Caleb said. 12. Whatever it was. He looked at the floor. "He's right." "I know," Maggie said. "I taught him that after his mother died. He was letting Victor come out twice a year and tell him how to feel about things, tell him how things should look. And I sat down with him and I told him to trust what he saw with his own eyes, to not let other people write the story of something he was living inside." He exhaled. "And then I did exactly that." Maggie shifted carefully so Lily's weight was better supported. "Victor scared you," she said. "That's not irrational. He has connections and he's not a man who makes empty statements." "No," Caleb agreed. "He's not." He looked up at her. "But I looked at what I was about to do and it wasn't protecting them. I was telling myself it was protecting them because that's easier than saying I was protecting myself from having a difficult conversation with Victor Hale and a difficult few months with people in town." He said this with the specific bluntness of someone being honest about themselves and finding it uncomfortable. That's what it was. And I dressed it up as concern for the children. Maggie waited. "I made the same mistake as every person in Granger who looked at you and decided before they knew," he said. "I let someone else's version of who you are override my own." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a man who is scared. That's different from a man who is careless." "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Scared people make bad decisions and then have to account for them. Careless people don't notice they've made one." He looked at her for a long moment. The dying lamp made the shadows in the cabin long and soft. "I don't want you to go," he said. "I know," she said. He stopped. He turned his coffee cup. He had brought it with him from the main house, still in his hand, and he turned it the way he always did when he was trying to find the words. "I need to say this correctly. Since Clara died, I have been operating inside a particular kind of numbness that I told myself was practicality. Getting through the work. Managing what needed managing. Not feeling too much of anything, because feeling too much of anything made it hard to do what the day required." He paused. "And then you arrived and you fixed the stove and reorganized the dry goods and made bread that my son ate 3 pieces of, and you talked to my daughter like she was a person worth talking to, and you didn't pretend with either of them. And I found myself—" He stopped again. "I found myself waking up in the morning thinking about things that weren't the fence line or the cattle count." Maggie looked at him. "I don't want you to stay because you're useful," he said. "You are useful. You are extraordinarily capable, and I have not said so often enough. But that's not why." He met her eyes. "I want you to stay because this house is better when you're in it, and I am better when you're in it. And when I thought about you walking down that road tomorrow morning, I could not— It wasn't a management problem. It was something else." The sleeping weight of Lily was warm against her side. Outside, the Montana dark pressed its indifferent cold against the cabin walls. The lamp gave its last real light and settled into a dim glow. "I'm not Clara," Maggie said. "I know that," he said immediately. No hesitation. "I'm not a substitute for her. I'm not a comfort in her shape. I am a different person with a different history and different habits, and I am not the soft version of anything. I have opinions, and I will tell you when I think you've made a bad decision, and I am not going to make myself smaller to fit what's convenient." "I know that too," he said. And the way he said it, level, unhurried, without the quality of someone reassuring a concern they're waiting to move past, told her he meant it. "The town will keep talking," she said. "The town talks about everything," he said. "It talked about me after Clara died. It talked about me before she died. It'll be talking about something else by harvest and then go back to talking about me after that. That's what towns do." "Victor will escalate." "Victor doesn't have a legal case," Caleb said. "His sister's children are well fed and housed and attending school and progressing in their work. The only argument he has is one he has to build from gossip, and a judge with any sense will tell him to take his gossip home." He paused. "I should have said that 2 weeks ago." "Yes," Maggie said. "You should have." He accepted this without argument, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether he had actually done the internal work of this conversation before bringing it to her. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. Not as the housekeeper, not as... He worked his jaw. "I'm not making a formal statement here. I know this is not the time or the way for that, but I'm asking you to stay as yourself, as the person you are, not the job, not the arrangement, you." She looked at him for a long moment. The complexity of the last 5 months sat between them, all of it, the apple cake and the recipe book, and the biscuits Thomas had made with uneven thickness, and the 3 days in the snowstorm, and the evening conversations, and the thing that had grown in this house that was not romantic in any simple sense but was real in every sense, the way the practical and the personal had woven together until neither was separable from the other. "If I stay," she said, "I stay on my terms." "Yes," he said. "I am not a replacement. Not for Clara, not for Mrs. Patterson, not for any idea people in this town have about what a woman in a house ought to be. I am who I am." "Yes," he said again. "And if you let Victor Hale or anyone else make that decision for you again..." "I know," he said. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. The remnant of the lamp made his face visible and honest. "If I let anyone else make that decision for me again, I will have lost something I can't get back. And I'll deserve to have lost it." She held that for a moment. Then she said, "Go get your daughter. She'll sleep better in her own bed." He got up from the floor, and he came to her and lifted Lily with the particular practiced ease of a father who has carried a sleeping child many times, and Lily murmured something and settled against his shoulder without waking. He stood there for a moment in the cabin door with Lily in his arms and looked at Maggie. "In the morning," he said. "Are you—" "I'll start the bread before dawn," Maggie said. "Same as always." He nodded. Something in his face that she was going to have to find a name for eventually, but not tonight. He took Lily home. Maggie sat alone in the cabin for a long time after. She sat and she thought about staying and what staying meant in a way that was different from how she had thought about it before. Before, staying had been about survival, practical and urgent and measured against the alternative of having nowhere. The calculation had been simple even when the situation was not. Now the calculation was different. She was not staying because she had to. She was staying because she was choosing to, which was an entirely other thing and came with an entirely other set of weights to carry. She was choosing a place that had already asked her to leave once. She was choosing a man who had, under pressure, made the wrong decision and had then, to his credit, and more quickly than she might have expected, unmade it. But the fact of the first decision did not disappear because the second had followed it. She would have to hold both of those things. She would have to stay awake to who he was in the easy moments and who he was when things got hard, and she would have to do that without either excusing the hard moments or making them the permanent definition of him. She was choosing children who needed her in ways that were real and also sometimes inconvenient, and who would grow up and grow away from needing her as all children did, and that would be its own kind of loss when it came. She was choosing a town that did not particularly want her there, and would continue expressing that in the particular small ways that towns express such things. She was choosing all of it. Not because it was perfect, it was as far from perfect as anything she'd known, but because it was real, and real was what she'd always been able to work with. She picked up the recipe book from the shelf by the door. She put it back in her trunk. In the morning, she unpacked the trunk. She did not tell the children that night what had been decided. They slept, Lily in her bed, Thomas in his, with the knowledge that they had said what needed saying and now were waiting for the adults to account for it. Maggie started the bread at 5 in the morning as she had told Caleb she would, and she heard him come into the kitchen at 6 and pour his coffee and sit at the table. And they did not speak right away, but the silence was the kind that comes after something has been resolved rather than the kind that comes before something must be said. Hector came in at 6:30 and poured his coffee and said, "Cold again this morning," and Maggie said it was, and the morning proceeded. Thomas came down for breakfast and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the counter where the bread was cooling and the eggs were on the heat and Maggie's coat was on its hook where it always was. He looked at her. "You stayed," he said. "I stayed," she said. He nodded once with the compressed satisfaction of someone who has been right about something that mattered and sat down at the table. Lily came in and looked around the kitchen and looked at Maggie and burst into the kind of tears that are almost entirely relief. The physical release of something the body has been holding for too long. She cried for about 45 seconds, which was all she needed, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "Can we have apple cake for breakfast?" "No," Maggie said. "Why not?" "Because apple cake is not breakfast food." "But you can have it after supper," Maggie said, "which means you need to eat your breakfast now so we can get to the rest of the day." Lily sat down and ate her breakfast. Thomas poured himself coffee. He had started doing this recently, had not asked permission, and Maggie had not commented on it, understanding it for what it was, and looked across the table at his sister with the expression of an older brother who has watched something resolve and is relieved but has no vocabulary for saying so. Caleb came back in from the yard where he had been giving Hector the morning's instructions and sat at the end of the table, and they ate together, the four of them, in the way that had become normal over 5 months and had nearly been lost and had not been. After breakfast, when the children had gone to their rooms to prepare for school and Hector was back out at the barn, Caleb sat at the kitchen table while Maggie cleared the dishes. "I need to go into Granger today," he said. "Ranch business. But I also—" He paused. "I'm going to speak to a few people about the situation, not arguing with them, just making it clear how things stand." Maggie looked at him over her shoulder. "I should have done it sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was hoping it would die down on its own." "It doesn't usually," she said, "not without something to replace it." "No," he agreed. "I know that." He stood up. "I'll be back by supper. If you need—" "I know where to find Hector," she said. He nodded. He put his cup in the wash basin, which he had started doing recently, and he put on his coat and his hat, and he stopped at the kitchen door. "Maggie," he said. She turned. He looked at her with the expression she still did not have a name for, the one she had first seen in the cabin the night before, the one that belonged to a man arriving somewhere after a long road. He held it for a moment, and she held his gaze, and then he said, "Thank you. For staying." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We haven't dealt with Victor." The corners of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, sir. Caleb Whitmore's smiles were never quick things. But the precursor to one, the shape his face made when something real had landed. He went out. She heard his horse go up the track toward the ridge. She turned back to the dishes and the kitchen and the bread that still needed attention and the supper that needed thinking about, and she let the morning proceed the way mornings at Rafter K proceeded, with work and purpose, and the particular kind of quiet that was not emptiness, but the sound of something functioning the way it was meant to. Caleb came back from Granger that evening with the tight jaw she had learned to read as someone who had done a difficult thing and was processing whether it had worked. He said 2 things over supper. The first was that he had spoken to Judge Parcher directly, as a courtesy, not because he believed Victor had a viable legal argument, but because he wanted the judge to hear the actual state of things from him before he heard a version from anyone else. He said the judge had listened, asked a few practical questions about the children's schooling and well-being, and told Caleb he had no concerns. The second thing he said was that he had run into Victor Hale's connection at the feed store, a man named Aldrich who had been one of the more vocal critics of the situation at the ranch, and had told him plainly that his household was run well and his children were thriving, and the continued commentary was neither welcome nor accurate. He said Aldrich had not responded much but had looked surprised, and in Caleb's experience, surprise in that particular kind of man was usually a sign that he had expected less. Thomas, listening to this, said, "Good," without looking up from his plate. Lily said, "What about Victor?" "Victor will do what Victor does," Caleb said. "We'll deal with it when there's something to deal with." "That's not a real answer," Lily said. "It's the honest one," Caleb said. Lily appeared to consider the value of honesty versus the value of resolution and settle on a provisional acceptance of it, which Maggie thought showed considerable maturity. After supper, after the children were in bed, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the recipe book open in front of her, not Clara's, hers, and added the notes she'd been meaning to add for 2 weeks. The adjustment to the venison stew timing for winter cooking. The discovery that the west window herbs grew faster if she turned the pots every 3 days. The biscuit ratio she and Thomas had arrived at together that produced a consistently better result than the original. She wrote carefully, because the notes were for reference and for whoever might come after, and because the act of writing them meant she intended there to be an after. She had intended it before, the first time she'd started the book. She intended it now with something more solid underneath it. Caleb came to the kitchen door and looked at her writing and did not ask what she was doing because he knew. "Get some sleep," she said without looking up. "You too," he said. He went to bed. She finished her notes, closed the book, put out the lamp, and went to her cabin through the cold March night with the stars visible between moving clouds and the ranch quiet around her, barn and house and fence line, and the track up to the ridge where the world opened wide and indifferent and enormous. She stood outside the cabin door for a moment and looked up at the stars. She was still here. That was not nothing. That was in fact the only place any real thing ever started. Spring came to Rafter Cay, the way spring always came to that part of Montana, not as an arrival so much as a gradual insistence, the cold loosening its grip degree by degree. Until one morning you walked outside and realized the air had a different quality, something with give in it, something that didn't press back. Maggie noticed it first in the kitchen garden. She had put seeds in the ground along the south side of the house in late March, working the soil on a day when the frost had retreated enough to make it possible, and for 2 weeks nothing visible had happened. Then on a Thursday morning in early April, she went out before breakfast and saw the first green threads pushing through. So thin and tentative they were, almost not there, but there. She stood and looked at them for a moment in the early light, and then went back inside to start the coffee, because that was what the morning required. But she noted them. She noted them the way she had learned to note the small things at Rafter Cay, which had turned out to be where most of the real things lived. The month after the night in the cabin had not been simple. She had not expected it to be simple, and it had met her expectations on that count. Victor Hale had written again in late March, a letter that Caleb read and showed to her, which was new, which meant something about the shift in what they were to each other. The letter was restrained but pointed, outlining Victor's continued concerns and suggesting, in the careful language of a man who had consulted someone with legal knowledge, that he retained the right to request a formal welfare review if he believed the children's circumstances warranted it. Caleb had read it, handed it to her, and said, "What do you think?" She had read it twice. Then she said, "He's pushing to see if you'll move. He doesn't have a case. A welfare review would show 2 children who are attended, fed, educated, and healthy. That's not a case." "No," Caleb said, "but it's a disruption." "He's betting you'll fold before the disruption to avoid the disruption," Maggie said. "Same strategy as before." Caleb looked at her. "Same answer as before?" "Same answer," she said. He wrote back to Victor. She did not read that letter because it was his to write. And Victor had not responded for 3 weeks. And when the response came, it was shorter and cooler and contained, for the first time, no further mention of formal proceedings. It was not a concession, exactly. It was more like a man who had pressed a door and found it solid and decided to stop pressing, at least for now. Hector, when Caleb told him the basics of it over morning coffee, said simply, "Good," and went back to his work, which was the highest form of commentary Hector offered on most subjects. Dale said, "I never liked that man's horse," which was irrelevant, but somehow satisfying. Well, the change in Granger was slower and less dramatic than Maggie had expected, which she supposed was realistic. Towns did not reverse their opinions like tides. They shifted incrementally, reluctantly, usually in response to evidence that had been accumulating for long enough that ignoring it became more work than adjusting to it. What changed first was the quality of the quiet when she walked into the dry goods store. It was still there, the quick assessment, the awareness of her presence, but it had lost the edge of active judgment. It was simply the quiet of people going about their business and being aware of someone new in the room, which was a different thing from the quiet that had a verdict built into it. Mrs. Eakins was the first to actually say something. It was a morning in April when Maggie was collecting supplies, and Mrs. Eakins, rolling brown paper around a parcel, said without looking up, "Mrs. Aldrich told me the Whitmore children have been doing well with their schoolwork this year." Maggie set her list on the counter. "They work hard," she said. "The boy especially," Mrs. Eakins said. "Miss Fuller, the schoolteacher, mentioned he's been reading above his level." "He found some books he liked," Maggie said. "That's usually all it takes." Mrs. Eakins looked up. She held Maggie's eyes for a moment with the expression of a woman doing a quiet recalculation, adjusting something she had believed against something she was being forced to consider. "You've done good work out there," she said. Simply. Not effusively, not with apology for what she'd said before, just as a fact she had decided to state. "Thank you," Maggie said, and picked up her parcel. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness or validation or any of the things that stories were supposed to deliver at this point. It was one woman in a dry goods store saying a true thing plainly, which was, in Maggie's estimation, exactly proportionate to what had happened and what was owed. She took it for what it was and went back to the ranch. Thomas turned 14 in April. He mentioned it on a Wednesday evening at supper, mentioned it the way he mentioned most things that mattered to him, sideways and without eye contact, saying that his birthday was Saturday and that he did not want any kind of fuss made about it. Maggie looked at him. "All right," she said. He looked up, surprised by the absence of argument. "No fuss," she said. "What do you actually want?" He thought about it with the seriousness he applied to most things. "Apple cake," he said finally. "And maybe, could we ride out to the North Ridge? You and me and Lily. Papa's been saying the elk have been coming down to the valley pasture." "I can ride," Maggie said, which was stretching the truth somewhat. She could stay on a horse, which was not the same as riding well, but she was not going to let accuracy prevent something important. Thomas looked at her with the particular expression that meant he knew she was stretching the truth and was going to let it pass. "Okay," he said. "I'll make the cake Friday," she said. "We'll eat it Saturday evening when we get back." He nodded and went back to his supper, and Lily looked across the table at Maggie with an expression of complete delight that she was trying very hard to keep contained, which was its own form of delight. Saturday came with the particular clear brightness of a mid-April morning after several days of cloud, the world looking almost aggressive in its visibility. Maggie had been on a horse 3 times in the last month. Caleb had been teaching her, without making it a lesson, in the way she had taught Thomas biscuits. And she was not graceful on the animal, but she was competent enough to cover ground. They rode out after breakfast, the 3 of them, with Caleb watching from the yard with his coffee and the expression he had developed over the past month that she was still finding words for. She had decided it was something in the neighborhood of quiet satisfaction, though that phrase made it sound more settled than it was. It had an alertness to it, an attention that had nothing passive in it. The North Ridge was 40 minutes out, and the valley pasture below it was, as Caleb had said, moving with elk. A group of 7 or 8 working through the low grass, unhurried, indifferent to the 3 humans on the ridge above watching them. Thomas pointed out a young male at the edge of the group and said something about its antler development that indicated he had been reading about it, which he would not admit to but which was obvious. Lily sat on her horse beside Maggie and watched the elk and said quietly, "Mama used to say the elk came down when the mountains were ready to let go of winter." Maggie looked at her. "I don't know what that means exactly," Lily said, "but I remember her saying it." "It means the seasons know what they're doing even when we don't," Maggie said. Lily considered this. "Do you think she'd be okay with this? With you being here?" It was a question Maggie had thought about herself, in the way she thought about things that had no clean answer, not obsessively, but honestly, turning it over to see its different sides. She thought about a young woman in a hotel kitchen in the summer of 1871, writing down a recipe with a note at the bottom that read, "From M." Keeping it through a marriage and 2 children and a life on a Montana ranch until the book ended up in the bottom cabinet behind a tin of lard. "I think she wanted her children to be happy," Maggie said. "I think she wanted this house to feel like a home. I think if those things were happening, she'd be all right with however they got there." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think so too." Thomas said nothing. He was watching the elk, but his shoulders had a quality they sometimes got when something had landed in him that he was letting settle rather than responding to, and Maggie recognized it and left it alone. They rode back at noon. The apple cake that evening was the 3rd she had made at Rafter K, and it had not gotten easier to make. She did not want it to get easier, in the way that certain things should retain a degree of effort, not because effort was virtuous in itself, but because the care involved was part of what the thing meant. She made it from Clara's recipe, the same as always. More cinnamon than you think, less sugar than you want. Thomas ate 2 pieces and said it was good, which from him was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Lily ate one piece and then asked for another and was told by her father that she had already had dessert, which led to a brief negotiation that Thomas stayed entirely out of with the wisdom of someone who had learned which battles were worth joining. Caleb had his piece at the table with everyone else, not standing at the counter the way he had the first time, eating with the family, which was different, which was a specific and deliberate different. After the children were in bed, he and Maggie sat on the front porch in the cold spring evening, which had become a thing they did without ever deciding to do it. The chairs were close enough for conversation and far enough apart to be unambiguous about what they were, which was two people who had arrived at something real and were proceeding carefully in the way that real things required. He said, "Victor wrote again." She looked at him. "Short letter," he said. "He wants to come in June, see the children." He paused. He didn't mention anything else. "Just the children," Maggie said. "Just the children." She looked out at the dark yard, at the barn where the lamp was still going because Hector was finishing a repair, at the fence line running east in the moonlight. She thought about Victor Hale and what it meant that his letter had narrowed to the children. Not the arrangement, not the appearances, not the town. Just the children. "Let him come," she said. Caleb looked at her. "He loves them," she said. "In his way. They should know their mother's family." She paused. "And seeing the house as it actually is, rather than how he imagined it, will be more useful than anything you or I could say to him." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're more generous with him than I am." "I'm not generous with him," she said. "I just think people who are wrong about things deserve the chance to be shown the actual truth before we decide they're permanently wrong." He turned his coffee cup. "Even when they tried to have you removed." "Even then," she said, "not because he deserves my generosity specifically, because it's the right way to handle it, and because those children deserve to grow up watching adults deal with conflict without contempt." The night was quiet around them. Somewhere on the ridge a nighthawk made its sound, that particular diving cry that belonged to the space between winter and full spring. "You think about them constantly," Caleb said. "Not as an accusation, as an observation, almost wondering." "They're worth thinking about," she said. "They're not yours," he said. And then, before she could respond, he added, "They should be." She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the yard, his jaw set in the way it set when he was saying something that had cost him a long time to build up to saying. The coffee cup was still in both hands. "I was a man who said important things sideways," she had learned, looking at the distance rather than the person, because the person made it too immediate, and he needed a little remove to get the words out. "That's not a practical statement," he said. "I know that. I don't mean to make it into something it isn't yet." He turned the cup. "But I want you to know that when I think about this ranch in 5 years and 10 years, I don't think about it without you in the picture. And it's not about what you do here. I want to be clear about that." "You've been clear," she said. "I want to keep being clear," he said, "because I wasn't for a while, and I know it." "Caleb," she said. He looked at her then. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He held her gaze for a moment with that expression, still the one she hadn't fully named, but she was closer to it now. It was the expression of a man who had stopped waiting for the thing to be taken away. Not entirely. The wariness was still there at the edge of it, because a year and a half of loss had put it there, and it didn't leave quickly. But underneath the wariness, settling in like something with actual weight and actual permanence, was something that looked like trust. "Okay," he said. They sat on the porch until the lamp in the barn went out, and Hector crossed the yard to the bunkhouse, and the ranch went quiet around them, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet with anything, because some silences are not absences but presences, and you learn to recognize the difference. June came, and Victor Hale came with it. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and this time Maggie heard the horse and did not brace for it the way she had in November. She heard it and noted it and kept working, because the work was what it was, regardless of who came and went. He came through the front door, knocking this time, which was itself a small and significant thing, and Caleb met him, and the two men had whatever conversation they needed to have in the front room while Maggie finished the bread she was shaping. He came to the kitchen door after perhaps 20 minutes. She turned to face him. He looked different from November. Not diminished. Victor Hale was not a man who diminished easily, but adjusted, somehow. like a man who had made an argument at full volume and then had to live for several months with the knowledge that the argument had not held. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Supper at 6. The corner of his mouth moved. Not warmth exactly, but the recognition of a reference. He remembered the first time she had said it, and he knew she remembered, and he was acknowledging both without making a scene of it. "The house looks well," he said. "The house is well," she said. He looked around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the herbs in the window pots, which had grown considerably since November, the recipe book on the small shelf by the door that had more pages filled now than blank. He looked at all of it with the eyes of a man doing a different kind of assessment than the one he'd done last time. "My sister's recipe book," he said, nodding at the shelf. "It stays here," Maggie said, "with the house." He nodded. "Good," he said, and he went to find the children. The 3 days of Victor's June visit were not easy. They were not meant to be easy. Victor was not a man who had transformed. He still had his opinions and his manner and his particular brand of interference that called itself love, which it partly was. He still asked too many pointed questions about the ranch finances and had too many suggestions about Thomas's future education, and watched the household with the attention of a man who was looking for validation of a concern he had not entirely relinquished. But he also sat at the kitchen table on the second morning while Lily showed him how to measure flour correctly, because Lily had decided to show him, and he paid attention. He sat with Thomas on the porch and listened to him talk about the elk in the valley pasture with genuine interest rather than the performed interest of his first visit. He ate the meals Maggie put in front of him and said, on the second evening, that the venison stew was the best he had eaten since he could remember, and there was nothing pointed in it. It was a man eating good food and saying so. On the last morning, before he left, he came to the kitchen alone. Maggie was at the stove. "I was wrong about some things," he said, without preamble, without padding, in the voice of someone who has prepared this sentence and is delivering it before they can find a reason not to. She turned around. "Not everything," he added, which was honest, "but some things." "All right," she said. "Clara would have—" He stopped, pressed his mouth flat, the way Caleb did, the way Thomas did, the family gesture for holding something in that wanted to come out. "She would have been less patient with me than you've been." "She sounds like she was a remarkable person," Maggie said. "She was," he said. "She was also stubborn as the Montana winter and completely unwilling to let me have the last word on anything that mattered." Something moved across his face that was not grief exactly, though it was adjacent to it. The expression of someone remembering a specific person rather than an abstraction of loss. "These children have some of her in them, both of them." "I know," Maggie said. You're good for them," he said, and the admission of it seemed to cost him something genuine. "I can see that. I should have been willing to see it sooner." She looked at him for a moment. This complicated, difficult, genuinely loving man who had come to this ranch with the intention of removing her and was leaving it, having said something that was about as close to an apology as his character allowed. "Come back in the fall," she said. "The children would like it." He looked at her. "The apple cake is better in October," she said. "The apples are right." He nodded once. Then he went to say his goodbyes to the children and to Caleb, and he rode out the way he had ridden in, up the track and over the ridge, and back toward whatever his life was outside of this place. Caleb came into the kitchen after he left and stood at the counter. "You invited him back," he said. "He loves those children," she said. "They need people who love them." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Even when those people are difficult." "Especially then," she said. "Easy love doesn't teach them much." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had been finding words for since April. She had landed on it finally, in the week before, lying awake in her cabin on a night when the spring air came through the window with the smell of the kitchen garden in it, the green smell of things that had been seeds and were now real. The expression was not complicated when she finally put the right word to it. It was simply this: a man who had stopped holding himself at a distance from his own life and had started living inside it again. That was all. That was everything. "The bread's going to burn," she said. He stepped back from the counter. She turned to the stove. "There are things that people say about a life well lived, that it follows a particular shape, that it moves toward some resolution that feels earned and clean and final. And there is a version of Maggie Holloway's story that goes that way. The woman who was rejected by the world and then found her place in it. The ending that validates all the difficulty that came before. But the truth of how Maggie's life at Rafter K continued was messier and quieter and more ordinary than any of that. Thomas, at 14, was still prickly about certain things. He still pressed too hard when he felt protective and still went quiet in a way that shut people out when he was scared. And learning to manage those habits was going to be the work of years, not months. He and Maggie still argued occasionally about his schoolwork, about the way he spoke to Lily when he was frustrated, about the afternoon he decided, without asking, to reorganize the barn tool storage in a way that seemed logical to him, and made Hector unable to find anything for 3 days. These arguments were not comfortable. They were honest and direct, and neither of them backed away from the honest thing, and they always ended with the relationship intact even when the disagreement was not, which was the only measure that actually mattered. Lily grew. She grew in the specific ways that 8-year-olds grow when they have stability and care, and someone who takes their questions seriously. She became more herself, more certain of what she thought and what she loved, more capable of holding complexity without being defeated by it. She also, at certain moments, tested the limits of Maggie's patience in ways that were entirely ordinary and entirely exhausting, and Maggie responded imperfectly to those tests more often than she liked to admit. Hector left in August, not because anything was wrong, but because his sister in Colorado was widowed and he had decided he needed to go help her. He left with the same economy of speech that characterized everything he did, shaking Maggie's hand at the kitchen door and saying it had been the best-run kitchen he'd ever eaten from, which she suspected was his version of a speech. Dale stayed and continued to grow towards something that would eventually be a decent man, though the process was not without setbacks. The ranch had a hard autumn, a problem with the cattle on the east pasture that cost them several head and several weeks of difficult work, and one argument between Caleb and a buyer in Granger that left him furious for 3 days, in the particular silent way that was hard to be around but which she was learning to navigate. She was not always right about how to navigate it. She pushed too hard sometimes and gave too much space other times, and the calibration of when to say something and when to let a mood run its course was not something she had mastered and probably would not master fully. But she stayed. That was the thing. Not the grand gesture, not the dramatic turning point, but the ongoing accumulation of staying, of being present through the days that were unremarkable, and the days that were hard, and the days that were genuinely good, all of them adding up to something that had no single name, but was recognizable to anyone who had ever built anything real. The question people in Granger eventually stopped asking about Maggie Holloway was not whether she belonged at Rafter K. They stopped asking that in the way all such questions eventually stop. Not with an answer exactly, but with the accumulation of evidence that renders the question obsolete. She was there. She continued to be there. The house ran, the children thrived, the ranch operated, and none of the disasters that had been predicted by concerned parties arrived. What arrived instead was time, and time has a way of making its own argument. The question that some of them started asking instead, the one Maggie caught in the edges of conversations when she came into town, the curiosity that replaced the censure, was a different kind of question. Not about her right to be somewhere, but about how she had managed it. How a woman who had walked into Granger at the end of her resources, who had been turned away from every door in town, had ended up at a ranch on the North Ridge and built something that held. She did not have a clean answer to that question. She was not sure clean answers were honest answers. What she had was this. She had been willing to do the unglamorous work. The bread before dawn, the shelf reorganization, the fixed stove seal, the conversation with a grieving boy about being allowed to be difficult. None of it spectacular, all of it necessary, and she had been willing to stay inside that necessity without waiting for it to become something more exciting than what it was, because she had understood for a long time through a hard education, that the unglamorous work was not the thing you did until the real thing arrived. It was the real thing. It had always been the real thing. The people who had underestimated her had done so because she did not look like what they imagined value to look like. And that failure of imagination was their loss, genuinely, not just in some consoling abstract sense. They had lost access to something real and capable and worth knowing because they could not get past the surface of it. That was not her problem to fix for them. She had stopped trying to fix it for them a long time ago. What she had tried to do instead What she continued to try to do, imperfectly and without any guarantee of success, was simply to be what she was in the place where she was, with as much honesty and care and stubbornness as she could bring to it on any given day. Some days she brought more of it than others. That was the truth of a human life. On an October evening, with the kitchen garden past its season and the herbs dried and hanging and the apple trees on the lower slope holding their fruit, Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table after supper and said, without turning his coffee cup for once, without looking at the table, looking at her directly, "I'd like you to marry me." She looked at him. "Not because it's practical," he said. "Not because of the children, though they are part of it. Because I want you here in the permanent way. Because I've been wanting to say this for 6 months and kept finding reasons why the timing was wrong, and I decided this morning that the timing is never going to be exactly right. And I would rather say it imperfectly than not say it." She looked at him for a long moment. "The town will have opinions," she said. "They'll get over it," he said. Victor will write a letter." "He'll come in November," Caleb said. "I already told him he should." She raised her eyebrows. "You told him before you asked me." "I told him I was planning to ask," he said. He paused. He said Clara would have said it was about time someone in this family made a sensible decision. Something moved through her at that. Not quite what she would have called sentiment, or not only that. Something more complicated, the feeling of a circle closing in a way she had not expected and had not earned by any calculation she could construct, which meant it was either luck or something she had no adequate name for. "I'll need to keep the kitchen the way I run it," she said. "I wouldn't change a thing in that kitchen," he said, "and the recipe book stays on the shelf." "Where it belongs," he said. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight, this man who was not simple and not perfect, and who had failed her once in a way that had cost them both something real, and who had come back from that failure in the manner of a person who had actually reckoned with it rather than explained it away. She thought about the morning she had stood at the top of the ridge and looked down at these buildings and decided to walk toward them. She thought about the firebox seal and the flour in the open sacks, and Lily's voice saying, "You remind me of my mother because the house feels like someone is in it," and Thomas saying, "You're the first person who helped me actually understand what I was feeling," and Hector saying, "It's the best run kitchen I've ever eaten from," and the green threads coming through the cold ground in April. She thought about her mother, who had been an excellent cook and a difficult woman, and who had told her once, when she was maybe 12 years old and had complained that something was too hard, that the things worth having were always the things that asked something real of you. That this was not a punishment, it was how you knew they were worth having. She thought about all of this in the space of a few seconds, which is how the mind works when something is actually important, assembling everything that matters into the moment that requires it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath she didn't think he'd known Fee was holding. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. And that was how it was decided. Not with ceremony, not with anything that would make a story better by conventional measures, but with two people at a kitchen table in the lamplight, the October dark pressing gently against the windows, the ranch quiet around them, and the particular quality of an ending that is also, plainly and without fanfare, a beginning. The bread was rising on the counter, the herbs were dry on their strings, the recipe book was on the shelf where it belonged, its pages filling. Outside, the Montana sky did what it had always done, vast and indifferent and full of stars. And Rafter K Ranch sat under it the way it had sat for years, and would sit for years to come, solid and imperfect and real. That is what Maggie Holloway built, in the end. Not a legend. Not a story people told to make themselves feel better about the world. Just a home. Just a life. Just the thing itself, which was, when you got close enough to see it clearly, more than enough.